She was 8 weeks pregnant with triplets when federal agents told her she had 30 minutes to disappear forever. Patricia Posey had just testified against the billionaire CEO she loved, Roy Scott, exposing the deaths he'd covered up to protect his empire. He'd dismissed her warnings, chosen profit over lives, and when she went to the authorities, his company made her a target. So she vanished. Changed her name. Raised Brian, Christopher, and Liliana in witness protection, moving them through 8 cities in 6 years, never staying long enough for friendships, never stable enough for childhood. Roy Scott spent those same 6 years building his billion-dollar empire, completely unaware he had children. Until the day Patricia testified before Congress, voice disguised, face hidden, and destroyed everything he'd built. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at his door, a medical report, 3 names in her handwriting, and the devastating realization, while he'd been signing memos in boardrooms, his children had been learning to pack their lives into duffel bags in the middle of the night. He never knew they existed. Now they're 6 years old, and they're about to meet the man who's the reason they never had a home. The day Roy Scott's world collapsed, he was watching it happen on live television. The congressional hearing had been running for 3 hours, stock prices dropping every 15 minutes, his phone vibrating so constantly he'd finally shut it off and left it face down on his desk like a corpse. The boardroom where he'd built Scott Dynamics into a trillion-dollar infrastructure empire was silent now. Empty Chosua. Abandoned by the same people who'd applauded his quarterly projections just 6 months ago. Roy sat alone in his glass-walled office 37 floors above Manhattan, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the muted television mounted across from his desk. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen hadn't changed in 2 hours. Whistleblower testimony brings tech giant to its knees. Key witness remains unidentified. The witness herself was positioned behind a privacy screen. Viewers at home saw only her silhouette, but members of Congress could see her face. And from the expressions in that hearing room, the tightened jaws, the controlled rage, the careful note-taking, Roy knew the testimony was devastating. He'd been watching on mute because he didn't need to hear it. He knew what she was saying, knew what documents she was presenting, knew which buried memos and suppressed safety reports she'd somehow managed to preserve despite his company's best efforts to erase them. What Roy didn't know was who she was. The DOJ had sealed her identity, protected witness, high-risk extraction, the kind of case where someone's life was in genuine danger, which meant whoever was behind that screen had information dangerous enough to warrant complete erasure from public record. Roy's instinct told him it was someone internal, someone who'd had access to files that shouldn't have existed anymore, someone who understood the company's architecture well enough to know exactly where the bodies were buried. But something else, something he couldn't name, made him reach for the remote, made him unmute the broadcast. And the voice that poured through the speakers stopped his heart mid-beat. On April 12th, a memo was circulated to the executive team. Subject line, acceptable loss parameters. The memo outlined projected casualties from the Jakarta infrastructure project and concluded that financial liability would be manageable if kept below 14 deaths. Roy's breath left him in a violent rush. That voice, calm, methodical, devastatingly precise. The way she pronounced parameters with a slight pause before the second syllable. The cadence, the control, the refusal to let emotion bleed into facts. He knew that voice. The memo was signed by Roy Scott, CEO of Scott Dynamics. Patricia. Roy's hands started shaking. Patricia Posey, the woman who'd vanished 6 years ago. His compliance analyst, his sharpest critic. He couldn't finish the thought. She was supposed to be gone, erased, disappeared into whatever life people build when they walk away from everything. But she wasn't gone. She was behind that screen, under oath, dismantling his empire with surgical precision. Roy watched, paralyzed, as the senator leaned forward. Ms. Posey, did Mr. Scott personally review this memo? Yes. And did he take action to address the safety concerns you raised? A pause. Brief. Waited. He promised to, after the next quarter. The hearing room erupted. Roy barely heard it. He was back in his office 6 years ago, Patricia standing across from his desk with a manila folder in her hands and fury in her eyes that she was trying desperately to keep controlled. 12 people died, Roy. 12. And you knew the infrastructure was faulty. He'd been annoyed, frustrated that she couldn't see the bigger picture, that she was making operational complexity into a moral referendum. Patricia, you're looking at this emotionally. Operationally, don't you dare. Her voice had been quiet, shaking. Don't make this about logic versus emotion. This is about right versus wrong, and you know the difference. He'd tried to salvage it, offered her a promotion, more authority, her own division. She'd looked at him like he'd struck her. I gave you a chance to do the right thing, Roy. You chose your empire. And then she'd walked out. He'd let her. Prioritized a conference call over going after her. 48 hours later, federal agents had her under protective custody. Her apartment was cleared. Her phone was disconnected. Her name scrubbed from every database his investigators could access. Roy had assumed she'd chosen her principles over him, over them. He'd been wrong about a lot of things. But he was about to discover just how wrong. The television continued. Patricia's voice, relentless and certain, laying out years of buried negligence, memos he'd signed, reports he'd ignored, warnings he'd dismissed because quarterly projections mattered more than hypothetical casualties in countries most of his board couldn't locate on a map. Roy's second monitor showed stock prices in freefall. His phone, still face down, vibrated once more before going silent. The empire he'd built on control was unraveling in real time, and the only thing Roy could think, the only coherent thought in the chaos screaming through his mind was, she's alive. Patricia is alive, and she's destroying me. Sometimes the hardest part of watching a story like this unfold isn't the betrayal. It's realizing you're watching someone face consequences they spent years avoiding. If you've ever had to confront a truth you weren't ready for, you understand what Roy's about to learn. This story gets deeper. Stay with me. The hearing concluded just after 6 p.m. Roy hadn't moved from his chair in 4 hours. His assistant knocked once. Mr. Scott, the board is requesting, tell them I'm unavailable. Sir, they're threatening to, I know what they're threatening. Tell them I'll resign if that's what they need. Silence. Then, sir? You heard me? The door closed. Roy stared at the now silent television. The news anchors were dissecting the testimony with barely concealed glee. Billionaire CEO brought down by whistleblower. The American dream turning into American accountability. They loved this narrative. Roy didn't care. He opened his laptop, typed Patricia's name into every database he had access to. Federal witness records, sealed court documents, protection program files. Every search came back empty. She'd been erased thoroughly, which meant her life had been in danger, which meant his company, his decisions, had put her there. The guilt hit him like a physical weight. He'd known Scott Dynamics had reach. Global infrastructure contracts meant global influence, bribes disguised as consulting fees, regulators who looked the other way for the right price, investigators who could be persuaded to find nothing worth finding. He'd built that machine, and when Patricia threatened to expose it, that machine had turned on her. Roy hadn't given the order, but he hadn't stopped it either. He'd been too focused on protecting the empire to protect the woman. His phone buzzed. A different sound. Not a call. A notification. He flipped it over. Building security. Package delivered to your residence. Marked personal and confidential. Courier refused to leave it with doorman. Insisted on direct delivery. Roy frowned. His private residence wasn't listed anywhere public. Only a handful of people knew that address. He left the office without a word to anyone. The drive home took 40 minutes in traffic that felt like hours. The package was sitting on his doorstep when he arrived. Small. Brown paper. No return address. Roy picked it up. Felt the weight of paper inside. He unlocked the door. Stood in his entryway. Marble floors, art he'd bought because advisors said it would appreciate. Furniture chosen by designers who'd never asked what he actually liked. The house was silent. It was always silent. Roy opened the package. Inside was a single document. A medical report. He recognized the letterhead. A clinic in Toledo. Dated 6 years, 2 months ago. Patient name, Margaret Flynn. He didn't recognize the name, but he kept reading. Diagnosis, multiple gestation confirmed. His breath caught. Estimated delivery, March 2019. Roy's hands started shaking. Number of fetuses, 3 triplets. The paper slipped from his fingers, drifted to the marble floor. Roy stared at it, read the words again. Triplets, 6 years, 2 months ago. He did the math in his head automatically, tried to place the timeline. 6 years, 2 months, 8 weeks before Patricia disappeared. The floor felt unsteady beneath him. Roy crouched, picked up the report with trembling hands. At the bottom, in handwriting he would recognize anywhere, 3 names were written in blue ink. Brian, Christopher, Liliana. The city lights blurred outside his windows. For the first time in his career, in his life, Roy Scott had no plan, no strategy, no next move, just 3 names written in Patricia's hand, and the devastating realization that she hadn't just been running from his company when she disappeared. She'd been running with something. 3 someones. Children who'd been born in hiding. Children who'd lived their entire lives under assumed names, in temporary homes, always moving, never safe. Children who'd never known their father, because their father had been too busy building an empire to notice what actually mattered. Roy sank into the chair by his entryway, still holding the medical report. The house was silent except for the sound of his breathing. And somewhere out there, in a city he didn't know, under a name he couldn't find, Patricia was putting 3 6-year-olds to bed. 3 children with his eyes, his chin, his blood. Children he'd never held, never met, never known existed. Until now. 6 years earlier. Patricia Posey stood outside Roy Scott's corner office with a manila folder in her hands and nausea rolling through her stomach in waves she kept attributing to stress. It wasn't stress, but she wouldn't know that for another 48 hours. Right now, all Patricia knew was that 12 people were dead, her company had buried the evidence, and the man she'd been sleeping with for 8 months had signed the memo authorizing the cover-up. She knocked once. Didn't wait for permission. Walked in. Roy was on a call. He glanced up, held up one finger. "Give me a minute," and continued talking about quarterly projections with someone who clearly had never worried about whether infrastructure would collapse beneath them. Patricia waited, counted to 60. Watched Roy in his element. Confident, commanding, the kind of man who made decisions that moved markets and never questioned whether he had the right. He ended the call, set his phone down, smiled at her like nothing was wrong. "Patricia, I wasn't expecting you until the compliance meeting this afternoon." She didn't smile back, crossed the distance between the door and his desk, set the manila folder down directly in front of him. "These documents prove negligence," she said. Her hands were steady. Her voice wasn't. "Fix it, or I go to the authorities." Roy's smile faded. He opened the folder. Patricia watched his face as he scanned the contents. Safety reports that had been buried, incident logs that had been deleted from official servers but preserved on backup drives, whistleblower complaints that had been silenced with NDAs and payouts, and at the bottom, the memo. Subject, acceptable loss parameters, signed by Roy Scott. "Where did you get these?" His voice was controlled. Too controlled. "Does it matter?" "Patricia, 12 people died in Jakarta, Roy." Her voice cracked on the number. 12. And you knew the infrastructure was faulty. You knew it 6 months before construction even started. Roy leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin. The gesture he used when he was about to explain why someone else's concern was overblown. Patricia's stomach turned. "You're looking at this emotionally," he said. "Operationally, we—" "Don't you dare!" The words came out sharper than she intended. Louder. Don't you dare make this about logic versus emotion. This is about right versus wrong, and you know the difference. Silence. Roy studied her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd walked in. What do you want me to do, Patricia? The project's complete. The settlements are finalized. Going public now would what? Hurt the stock price? Cost you board votes? She was shaking now. Couldn't stop it. People died, Roy, and you're worried about optics. He stood, came around the desk, tried to take her hand. She stepped back. Patricia. His voice softened, the voice he used when they were alone. When the world was just the two of them and nothing else mattered. I hear you. I do. And you're right. But there are ways to handle this that don't burn down everything we've built. We? The company, our reputations, your career. My career? She laughed. It sounded broken. You think I'm worried about my career? Roy's jaw tightened. He was losing patience. She could see it in the way his shoulders squared, the way he retreated back behind his desk, putting furniture between them like a barricade. What do you want? He asked again. I want you to fix this. Publicly. I want you to acknowledge what happened, compensate the families properly, fire whoever buried these reports, implement the safety protocols that should have been in place from the beginning. That would cost. I know what it would cost. Roy was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone, checked his calendar. Give me until after Q3, he said. I'll form a task force, bring in outside auditors. We'll do a full compliance review and… No. He looked up. No? Not after Q3. Not after the next board meeting. Not after you've had time to strategize how to spin this. Patricia's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. Now, Roy, fix it now. That's not realistic. Then I'm going to the authorities. Patricia. His voice hardened. Think about what you're saying. Think about what you're risking. I am thinking about it. Are you? Roy stood again. This time he didn't try to close the distance, just looked at her from across his desk, across the space that suddenly felt like miles. I'm offering you a solution, he said. Lead the new compliance division. Full authority. You'd report directly to me. Name your salary. We'll implement every reform you think is necessary. Together. Patricia stared at him. Felt something inside her chest crack clean through. You're trying to buy me. I'm trying to work with you. You're trying to silence me, just like you silenced everyone else. The betrayal on her face must have registered because Roy's expression shifted, softened. For just a second, he looked like the man she'd fallen for 8 months ago, the one who'd stayed late helping her review contracts, who'd listened when she talked about systems that protected people instead of profits, and who'd made her believe he actually cared about doing the right thing. Patricia, please. She picked up the folder, turned toward the door. I gave you a chance to do the right thing, Roy. You chose your empire. Patricia, wait. He came around the desk. Let's talk about this after… She stopped, looked back at him one last time. There is no after, Roy, not for us. Not anymore. And then she walked out. Roy stood in his doorway, watched her cross the hall toward the elevators, her shoulders straight, her stride purposeful. He should have followed her, should have stopped her, should have done anything except stand there calculating how much damage she could actually do and whether his legal team could contain it. His phone rang. Conference call. Board members waiting. Roy looked at Patricia one more time. Watched the elevator doors close, made his choice. He went back to his desk, answered the call, prioritized the empire over the woman, the moment that would cost him everything. You ever notice how the biggest mistakes in life aren't the dramatic ones? They're the quiet moments when we choose comfort over courage, when we tell ourselves later, and later never comes. If that hits home for you, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button, because this story's about to show you exactly what later costs. 2 days later, Patricia walked into a federal building in Lower Manhattan with the same manila folder and a lawyer she'd found through a friend of a friend who specialized in whistleblower cases. The FBI agent who met with her was young, professional, took notes on everything she said without interrupting. When she finished, he looked up from his legal pad. "Ms. Posey, you understand the risk you're taking?" Patricia's hands were folded in her lap. Steady now. The nausea had gotten worse over the past 48 hours, but her resolve hadn't wavered. "I understand the risk of staying silent," she said. The agent nodded. "We'll need to verify the documents. Run our own investigation. If what you're alleging is accurate, Scott Dynamics has the resources to retaliate, aggressively. I know. We can offer protection, but it would mean, I know what it would mean." Another nod. "Give us 72 hours. Don't go back to your apartment. Don't contact anyone at the company. We'll be in touch." Patricia left the federal building at 4:15 p.m. By 4:45, she was sitting in a clinic waiting room because the nausea hadn't stopped, and she'd missed her period, and there was a possibility she needed to consider before her entire life imploded. The pregnancy test came back positive. The ultrasound came 20 minutes later. Patricia stared at the screen, at the grainy black and white images that didn't make sense at first. "Wait," the technician said. Her voice changed. "I'm seeing... there might be... let me get the doctor." The doctor came, studied the screen, moved the wand across Patricia's abdomen with professional efficiency. "Ms. Posey, I'm seeing 3 distinct gestational sacs." Patricia's hearing went distant, muffled. "3? Yes. It appears you're pregnant with triplets, very early still, about 8 weeks based on measurements. But all 3 have detectable heartbeats." Patricia couldn't breathe, couldn't think. 3 babies. Roy's babies. Growing inside her while she'd just destroyed his company and put herself in federal crosshairs. "Do you have support?" the doctor was asking. "Partner? Family?" Patricia shook her head, took the ultrasound photo they printed for her, walked out of the clinic in a daze. She made it 2 blocks before she had to sit down on a bench, pulled out the ultrasound photo, stared at 3 tiny blobs that would become children. Roy's children. She should tell him. She should. Her phone rang. "Unknown number," she answered. "Miss Posey, this is Agent Morrison. We need you to come in, now." The federal building again. Different room this time. Morrison with 2 other agents and a woman in a suit who introduced herself as Patricia's DOJ-appointed attorney. "We've verified your documents," Morrison said, "and we've uncovered additional evidence that suggests Scott Dynamics has been engaged in systematic fraud, bribery, and criminal negligence for at least 7 years. This is bigger than Jakarta." Patricia's hands tightened on the ultrasound photo in her purse. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you're a federal witness in a massive criminal case. It also means Scott Dynamics and everyone connected to them now views you as a threat." "They wouldn't. They already have." Morrison slid a folder across the table. "Investigators showed up at your apartment 3 hours ago. They're not law enforcement. They're private. And they're being paid very well to find you." The room tilted. "What do I do?" Morrison exchanged glances with the attorney. "Witness protection," the attorney said. "Full relocation. New identity. New life. It's the only way to guarantee your safety." "For how long?" "Until the case concludes and the threat is neutralized. Could be months. Could be years." Patricia thought of Roy, of 8 months together, of the way he'd looked at her across his desk when he'd chosen his empire. She thought of 3 heartbeats inside her that he didn't know about. "I need to make a call," she said. "No." Morrison's voice was firm. "No calls. No contact with anyone from your previous life. If you do this, you disappear completely. Tonight." At 2:17 a.m., federal agents appeared at Patricia's apartment with duffel bags and instructions. 30 minutes to pack what matters. Your name, your life, your identity. They end tonight. Patricia moved through her apartment like a ghost. Clothes, documents, photos of her parents who'd died when she was 23. The ultrasound photo. She stared at it under the bathroom light while agents waited in her living room. 3 babies. She could tell Roy. Call him. Give him a choice. But Roy had already made his choice. And if she told him, he'd try to find her. He'd use every resource at his disposal. He'd put himself and these children at risk because he'd see it as a problem to solve, a situation to control. He wouldn't see it as 3 lives that needed protecting more than they needed a father. Patricia folded the ultrasound photo, put it in her pocket, made her choice. By 3:30 a.m., she was in a federal vehicle heading to a safe house in Toledo under the name Margaret Flynn. By 4 a.m., she was sitting alone in a sterile room with her hand pressed against her stomach. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the 3 heartbeats beneath her palm. "I'm so sorry. But he can't know. Not ever." That decision, the one she made in 30 minutes while federal agents waited, would define the next 6 years. But someone knew. Someone always knows. And 6 years later, someone would send Roy Scott that medical report and change everything all over again. 7 months pregnant. Patricia, Margaret Flynn now, she had to remember, always Margaret, sat in a prenatal clinic in suburban Toledo with her hands folded over a belly that felt impossibly large and a wedding ring on her finger that had never belonged to anyone real. The nurse called her name. "Margaret Flynn?" Patricia stood, answered to a dead woman's identity. Her handler had been clear about the backstory. Widow, husband died in a car accident 18 months ago, no family, moved to Toledo for a fresh start. Keep it simple. Simple stories were harder to disprove. The doctor was kind, mid-50s, the type who'd probably delivered half the babies in this suburb and remembered every single one. "How are we feeling today, Margaret?" "Tired, nauseous, large," the doctor smiled. "That's normal with multiples. Let's take a look." The ultrasound showed 3 distinct shapes, 3 heartbeats, all strong, all growing exactly as they should. "They look good," the doctor said. "But triplets are high risk. Do you have support? Family coming to help after delivery?" Patricia's throat tightened. "Yes. My family's coming." The lie tasted like ash. Her family was dead. Her real name was erased. And the father of these children didn't know they existed because telling him would have meant risking all 4 of their lives. "Good. You're going to need it." 3 babies is... The doctor paused, chose her words carefully. "It's wonderful. And overwhelming. Don't try to do it alone." Patricia nodded, left the clinic with prescriptions she'd fill under a fake name and an appointment for next week, and the suffocating knowledge that she was completely, devastatingly alone. March 7th arrived with complications. Patricia's water broke at 34 weeks. Early, but not dangerously so for triplets. She called the number her handler had given her for emergencies. Within 20 minutes, a federal agent was driving her to the hospital with instructions to use her Margaret Flynn identification and not to call anyone, tell anyone, trust anyone. The labor lasted 14 hours. Ended with an emergency C-section when baby A, Brian, she'd already chosen the names, written them down in a journal she kept hidden, showed signs of distress. Patricia was awake for the delivery, heard the first cry, then the second, then the third. 3 babies, 2 boys, 1 girl. The nurse brought them over one at a time. Let Patricia see their faces before they were taken to the NICU for monitoring. Brian, 5 pounds, 2 ounces. Dark hair, serious face even at seconds old. Christopher, 4 pounds, 11 ounces. Lighter, quieter, watchful. Liliana, 4 pounds, 8 ounces. The smallest, eyes already open, studying everything. They all had Roy's chin, his mouth, his dark hair. Patricia held each one for 30 seconds before they were taken away for tests and monitoring and all the medical interventions that premature multiples required. Then she was alone in a recovery room with stitches pulling across her abdomen and 3 empty arms and tears that wouldn't stop coming. A nurse checked on her an hour later, found Patricia crying silently, staring at the ceiling. "Are you in pain? I can get you something. I'm fine." "Is someone coming?" The father? Patricia's voice came out flat. Empty. There is no father. The nurse's expression shifted. Sympathy. Pity. The look people give single mothers they assume made poor choices. She didn't understand. Patricia hadn't made poor choices. She'd made impossible ones. And now she had 3 babies with Roy's face, who would never know him. The triplets came home after 12 days in the NICU. 3 car seats. 3 cribs Patricia assembled alone in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like fresh paint and had bars on the windows. For 9 months, Patricia learned what it meant to be a mother to triplets with no help. She learned to sleep in 20-minute increments, learned to feed 3 babies simultaneously using positioning pillows and determination, learned which cry meant hungry and which meant tired and which meant, I just need you to hold me, but you're holding my siblings instead and I'm furious about it. She learned Brian was the protector. Even at 6 months old, he'd cry when his siblings cried, like he was trying to alert her to their distress. Christopher was gentle, watched everything. Rarely fussed, Liliana was stubborn, opinionated, the last to sleep and the first to wake. Patricia learned to love them with a ferocity that terrified her, and she learned that safety was temporary. The call came when the triplets were 9 months old. Her handler's voice was clipped. Professional. Pack. We're relocating. Patricia's blood went cold. She was in the kitchen. 3 babies in high chairs, covered in mashed carrots, the television playing children's music videos in the background. Why? What happened? Scott Dynamics hired investigators. They're searching for you. Toledo's compromised. Patricia's hands started shaking. How compromised? They haven't found you yet, but they're close. You have 4 hours. 4 hours to pack a life. 3 babies, 3 car seats. Clothes and diapers and formula and the few possessions she'd been allowed to keep. By midnight, they were in Portland. Different apartment, different name, same fear. The triplets adjusted faster than she did. They didn't understand that home had changed, that the walls were different colors and the windows faced a different direction, and the sounds at night were unfamiliar. They just needed their mother. Patricia wasn't sure she knew how to be enough. Brian's first word was, Mama. His second was, Dada. He was 2 years old. Playing with blocks in their 3rd apartment. Phoenix this time, summer heat pressing through windows that didn't open far enough. Dada? Brian looked up at Patricia. Expectant. Curious. Patricia froze. Christopher, playing beside his brother, repeated it. Dada? Dada? Liliana watched her mother's face with those sharp, assessing eyes. Patricia knelt down, forced her voice to stay steady. Daddy had to go away, but he loved you very much. The lie felt like betrayal, but the truth felt worse. Brian accepted this, went back to his blocks. Christopher nodded, seemed satisfied. Liliana kept watching. She always knew when Patricia was lying. I don't know if you've ever had to start over with nothing. New city, new name, new story. But imagine doing it with 3 babies who can't understand why home keeps changing. That's not survival. That's endurance. And if you're still with me, comment below. How far would you go to protect your children? By the time the triplets were 3, they'd lived in 5 cities. Toledo, Portland, Phoenix, Denver, Albuquerque. Patricia had worked under-the-table jobs when she could find childcare. Cleaning, data entry, anything that paid cash and didn't ask questions. The federal stipend covered rent and basics. Barely. She'd learned to never use the same park twice. Never make friends with other mothers at library story time. Never let the triplets form attachments to places or people or routines that would break their hearts when they had to leave. She'd learned to teach them the rules without explaining why. Don't tell anyone Mommy's real name. Brian, serious even at 3, had asked, Why? It's a game, a secret game. What happens if we tell? Patricia's chest tightened. We have to move again. Brian nodded. Understood. Became the enforcer with his siblings. Remember, he'd whisper to Christopher and Liliana before preschool. Secret game. Don't tell. Christopher always obeyed. Liliana asked more questions. Why is it secret? Why can't we have friends? Why do we always leave? Patricia had no good answers. Just the truth she couldn't tell. Because your father built an empire, and that empire wants me silenced, and keeping you safe means keeping you hidden. The cost of safety was a childhood with no roots, no permanence, no certainty that tomorrow would look anything like today. October, 3 years after the triplets were born. Patricia was folding laundry in their Albuquerque apartment, while the children played with second-hand toys she'd found at a thrift store. The television was on. News. Patricia never watched it anymore, too painful seeing the world she'd left behind. But the headline caught her attention. Scott Dynamics criminal trial begins. She turned up the volume. Roy's face filled the screen. Older, tired, standing outside a courthouse with lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. Reporter: Mr. Scott, how do you respond to charges of criminal negligence and corporate fraud? Roy looked directly at the camera. I take full responsibility for failures in oversight. The victims and their families deserve justice. Patricia's breath caught. He looked broken. Mama, who that? Christopher was pointing at the screen, at Roy's face. Patricia's hands shook as she reached for the remote. Nobody, baby. Nobody. She turned off the television, gathered all 3 children close, Brian studying her face. Mama sad? No, sweetheart. Mama's fine. But she wasn't fine. She was watching the man she'd loved, the father of her children, face consequences for choices that had destroyed both their lives, and her children were asking about a man whose face they'd never seen but somehow recognized in their own. That night, after the triplets finally fell asleep in their shared bedroom, Patricia sat alone in the dark and wondered if she'd made the right choice. If keeping them from Roy had protected them, or stolen something they'd needed, if the lies she told them every day were keeping them safe, or teaching them that truth was negotiable. If love was enough when it came wrapped in deception. She didn't have answers, just 3 sleeping children with their father's face and a life built on secrets that felt like they were suffocating them all. Every time she relaxed, every time she thought they were safe, the phone would ring. Time to move again, and Patricia would pack 3 small lives into duffel bags and start over. Again. Always again. 3 years passed like that. 8 cities, 12 different schools, 37 moves. The triplets turned 4, then 5, then 6. And Patricia kept waiting for the call that never came, until the day federal prosecutors told her the case was finally ready. The trial that would end it all, or destroy what was left. Patricia Posey stood in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., with 3 federal marshals downstairs, and her children 60 miles away in a safe house she wasn't allowed to know the location of. Security protocol. If she didn't know where they were, she couldn't accidentally reveal it. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Caroline Reeves who'd been building the case against Scott Dynamics for 4 years, sat across from Patricia reviewing testimony points for the 3rd time. We need you, Caroline said. Not unkindly, just factual. You're the only one who can connect the dots. Roy Scott personally approved the cover-ups. Only you witnessed the conversations. Only you have the documentary evidence corroborated by first-hand knowledge. Patricia stared at her hands. 6 years of running. 8 cities. 3 children who'd never had a stable home. I have children, she said quietly. 3 of them. What happens to them if... We'll protect them. We'll protect all of you. You've been protecting us for 6 years. We're still running. Caroline leaned forward. This ends it, Patricia. You testify. We convict. Scott Dynamics dissolves. The threat disappears. You get your life back. What life? My children don't even know my real name. Then give them one. Real name. Real home. Real future. Caroline's voice softened. But we can't do that without your testimony. Patricia pulled out her phone, looked at the photos the marshals had sent that morning. 3 6-year-olds eating breakfast in a safe house, supervised by armed federal agents. Brian's serious face, already protective of his siblings even at 6. Christopher's gentle smile, the peacemaker. Liliana's watchful eyes, always seeing more than Patricia wanted her to. They deserved better than this, better than aliases and midnight relocations, and a mother who jumped every time a car door slammed. Patricia looked up. "When do I testify?" "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The risk was obvious. Roy would know she existed, would know she was alive, would know she'd been the one destroying everything he'd built. But maybe, this was how it finally ended. The congressional hearing room was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, senators arranged in a semicircle like judges at an inquisition. Patricia sat behind a privacy screen. Her voice would be modulated for the broadcast, distorted enough that casual listeners wouldn't recognize her. But everyone in the room could see her face. Caroline had prepared her for this. "The public gets anonymity. Congress gets accountability. Can you handle that?" Patricia had nodded. Now, sitting under fluorescent lights with a microphone clipped to her collar, and senators staring at her like she was either a hero or a traitor, depending on their political affiliation, she wasn't sure she could handle anything. But she'd come too far to stop now. The committee chair gavelled the session to order. "Ms. Posey, please state your name and former position for the record." Patricia's mouth was dry. She reached for the water glass, took a sip, thought of 3 children waiting for her to come home, and spoke. "My name is Patricia Posey. I was senior compliance analyst at Scott Dynamics from 2016 to 2019. 37 floors above Manhattan, Roy Scott dropped his glass. It shattered against the marble floor of his office, bourbon and broken crystal spreading across white stone. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stared at the television where a distorted voice was speaking words he recognized even through the modulation. Patricia. She was alive. She was testifying. She was destroying him. The testimony was methodical, devastating, precise. Patricia walked the committee through 6 years of evidence. Email chains showing Roy had personally approved suppressed safety reports. His signature on documents marked "Contain and Monitor," corporate shorthand for "bury this before it becomes public." Senator Williams leaned into his microphone. "Ms. Posey, you've alleged that Mr. Scott was directly informed of worker casualties in Jakarta. Can you elaborate?" Patricia's voice was steady. No hesitation. "Yes, I brought the evidence to Mr. Scott personally on October 4th, 2018. I told him 12 people had died due to infrastructure failures that were documented in our safety assessments 6 months prior to construction. And what was his response? He said he would address it after the third quarter earnings report." The hearing room erupted. Senators talking over each other, reporters typing frantically, cameras flashing. Senator Williams gavelled for order. "Ms. Posey, did Mr. Scott know people had died?" Patricia looked directly at the camera broadcasting her testimony to the world. "Yes, I told him personally. He asked me to wait until after Q3. Roy, alone in his office, put his head in his hands. He remembered that conversation. Remembered Patricia standing in front of his desk with fury and disappointment in her eyes. Remembered choosing the empire over doing what was right. And now the empire was burning. The testimony lasted 4 hours. By the time it concluded, every major news outlet had the story as their lead. Whistleblower destroys tech giant from the inside. Scott Dynamics CEO implicated in cover-up of worker deaths. Anonymous witness testimony may bring down billion-dollar company. Roy's phone showed 247 missed calls. Board members, lawyers, PR crisis team, investors demanding explanations he didn't have. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Stock prices were in freefall. Everything Roy had built over 20 years was collapsing in real time. And all he could think was, she's alive. Patricia's alive. She's been alive this whole time. The rest, the company, the money, the reputation, felt suddenly devastatingly irrelevant. Here's what people don't talk about with whistleblowers. They don't just risk their careers. They risk their identities, their safety, their futures. Patricia risked everything. And if you've ever had to choose between what's easy and what's right, you know that weight. Share this story. Someone needs to hear it. That night, Roy was still in his office. The city lights stretched endlessly below him, the same view he'd had for 15 years. He used to think he owned this city, controlled it. Now he understood he'd controlled nothing that actually mattered. His assistant knocked. "Mr. Scott, you should go home." "I don't have a home. I have a house. There's a difference." She left quietly. Roy stood to leave. Finally. After 16 hours in the same office watching his life implode, that's when he saw it. A package on his assistant's desk. Small, brown paper. His name written in block letters. "When did this arrive?" His assistant returned. "Courier delivered it an hour ago. Marked personal and confidential. I was going to—" "I'll take it." Roy picked up the package, felt the weight of paper inside, drove home in silence. His penthouse was dark, empty, cold despite the expensive heating system. He stood in his entryway, marble floors he'd never chosen, art he'd bought because advisors said it would appreciate, furniture selected by designers who'd never asked what he actually wanted. The package felt heavy in his hands. He opened it. Inside was a medical report from a clinic in Toledo. Patient name? Margaret Flynn. Date? 6 years, 2 months earlier. Diagnosis? Multiple gestation confirmed. Roy's heart stopped. Estimated delivery? March 2019. His hands started shaking. Number of fetuses? 3. Triplets. The report slipped from his fingers, drifted to the marble floor. Roy stared at it. 6 years. 2 months ago. 8 weeks before Patricia disappeared. The timeline clicked into place with devastating precision. She'd been pregnant when she came to his office with that folder. Pregnant when he'd offered her a promotion instead of justice. Pregnant when she'd walked out and he'd let her go. Pregnant when she'd vanished into witness protection. Roy crouched, picked up the report with trembling hands. At the bottom, in handwriting he would recognize anywhere, Patricia's careful script, 3 names were written in blue ink. Brian, Christopher, Liliana. Roy collapsed into the chair by his entryway. The medical report clutched in his hands. The city lights blurred outside his windows. He'd spent 6 years building empires and closing deals and expanding markets. Patricia had spent 6 years hiding 3 children from the world. His children. Children who'd been born in witness protection because his company, his choices, had made their mother's life worthless to men who protected profits over people. Children who'd lived in 8 different cities under fake names because he'd built a machine that couldn't tolerate truth. Children who'd never known their father because their father had chosen quarterly earnings over doing what was right. Roy stared at his reflection in the dark window. The man who controlled everything had controlled nothing that mattered. Behind him, his empire burned. In front of him, a photograph of 3 children he'd never met. 3 names written in Patricia's hand. 3 lives he'd never known existed until this moment, and the devastating knowledge that while he'd been living his life, they'd been living in hiding. Because of him. Roy had 2 choices now. Let his lawyers handle the fallout and pretend he didn't know about the children, or do something he'd never done in his entire career. Admit he was wrong, and try, somehow, to fix what he'd broken. If it wasn't already too late. The private investigator's name was Marcus Chen, former FBI, 20 years tracking people who didn't want to be found. Reputation for discretion, and results in equal measure. Roy hired him 3 days after receiving the medical report. They met in Roy's penthouse because Roy was already being followed by media vultures who wanted photos of the fallen billionaire for their evening broadcasts. Marcus spread documents across Roy's dining table, federal witness protection protocols, legal constraints, jurisdictional boundaries. Federal witness protection, Marcus said without preamble. That's a wall I can't break through. Not legally. Not without triggering alerts that would get both of us arrested and her relocated again. Roy's jaw tightened. There has to be a way. There is. Wait for the trial to conclude. Once the case is resolved and the threat is neutralized, protection orders get modified. She can choose to make contact. or allow contact. How long? Marcus consulted his notes. Your trial starts in 2 weeks. Prosecution's estimating 3 months to conclusion, then another few weeks for protective status review, so 3 months. Maybe 4. That's too long. It's the only way that doesn't get you arrested, and her moved to a location you'll never find. Marcus leaned back. Mr. Scott, I've been doing this a long time. The people who get what they want are the ones who play by the rules when it matters. This matters. Roy stared at the documents. 3 months minimum before he could even attempt contact. 3 months wondering if Brian, Christopher, and Liliana were safe. Healthy. Happy. 3 months imagining what they looked like. Sounded like. Whether they had his temperament or Patricia's grace. 3 months was an eternity, but it was also his only option. Fine, Roy said. What do I do? Marcus stood. You focus on your trial. You cooperate. You don't make Patricia regret her testimony by turning yourself into a liability. And when the time comes, you let her decide if she wants you in their lives. And if she doesn't, then you live with it, because that's what fathers do. They put their children's needs first, even when it destroys them. 2 days later, Roy sat across from his defense attorney in a conference room that smelled like expensive leather and desperation. Daniel Morse had been Roy's attorney for 12 years, had won every case, negotiated every settlement, turned every potential disaster into a managed inconvenience. We can drag this out, Daniel said, sliding a legal strategy across the table. Get you a settlement, maybe 18 months probation. Fine, instead of prison time. The prosecution wants this over. They'll negotiate. Roy didn't pick up the document. No. Daniel blinked. No? I want this over. Plead guilty to everything we're actually guilty of. Roy, that's criminal negligence, corporate fraud, suppression of evidence. We did it, all of it. I signed the memos. I approved the cover-ups. I prioritized profit over safety. Roy's voice was flat. Final. I want to plead guilty. Do you understand what you're saying? You're looking at prison time. Massive fines. Complete dissolution of Scott Dynamics. Your reputation is already destroyed and deserves to be. Daniel stared at him. What happened to you? Roy thought of 3 names written in Patricia's handwriting. I finally figured out what matters. The guilty plea happened on a Tuesday morning in federal court. The gallery was packed. Media, former employees, families of the Jakarta victims wearing photographs of their dead pinned to their shirts like armor. Roy stood before Judge Harrison and entered his plea. How do you plead to charges of criminal negligence resulting in loss of life? Guilty, Your Honor. Corporate fraud and suppression of evidence? Guilty. The judge studied him over reading glasses. Mr. Scott, do you understand the consequences of this plea? Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand you're waiving your right to trial and accepting full responsibility for these crimes? Roy looked directly at the judge. Yes. And I should have understood them 6 years ago, when I had the chance to prevent all of this. Silence in the courtroom. Then the judge spoke. Given your plea and cooperation with federal investigation, I'm sentencing you to 18 months house arrest, $2.3 billion in fines to be distributed to victims' families, and dissolution of Scott Dynamics with all assets liquidated to satisfy judgments. Do you understand this sentence? I do. Then we're adjourned. The media called it Billionaire Falls from Grace. Roy's former colleagues called it career suicide. His board called it betrayal. Roy didn't care about any of it. He was counting days until the protection order could be modified, until he could find Patricia, until he could meet his children. Everything else was noise. House arrest meant an ankle monitor and a penthouse that felt more like a prison than his corner office ever had. Roy couldn't leave, couldn't work, couldn't do anything except sit with the consequences of choices he'd made when he thought empire building was the same as life building. So he studied, ordered books on child development, on parenting multiples, on what 6-year-olds needed emotionally, developmentally, psychologically. His assistant, one of 3 employees who hadn't immediately quit, brought them without comment. left them stacked on his dining table like homework assignments from a life he should have been living all along. The Wonder of Threes, Parenting Multiple Children. 6-year-old development, a comprehensive guide. Building trust with children who've experienced trauma. Roy read them cover to cover. Learned that 6-year-olds were developing moral reasoning, testing boundaries, learning who they could trust and why. Learned that children in witness protection often struggled with attachment issues, hypervigilance, difficulty forming peer relationships. Learned that being a father wasn't about biology. It was about showing up. Consistently. Patiently. Without expecting anything in return, his assistant found him one afternoon surrounded by parenting books, taking notes like he was preparing for a board presentation. "Sir, why are you reading The Wonder of Threes?" Roy didn't look up. "Research." She didn't ask what for, but the next day, she left 3 stuffed animals on his table. Bears. Identical. Soft brown fur and black button eyes. Roy stared at them. "I thought..." She hesitated. "I thought maybe you'd want to have something ready when the time comes." Roy's throat tightened. "Thank you." After she left, he went shopping online. Ordered carefully, thoughtfully. 3 books about bravery and family and second chances. 3 blankets in different colors because maybe they had preferences. 3 everything. Gifts he couldn't give yet. Gifts he might never get to give if Patricia decided he didn't deserve the chance. But he bought them anyway, because hope was all he had left. 4 months after his sentencing, Roy was reading about how to talk to children about difficult topics when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct, desperation, hope, made him pick up. "Mr. Scott?" A woman's voice. Professional. Familiar. "Yes. This is Carolyn Reeves, federal prosecutor assigned to your case." Roy stood up so fast his chair fell backward. "Is Patricia... Are they..." "They're safe. But I'm calling because Ms. Posey has agreed to one supervised meeting." Roy couldn't breathe. "A meeting. You, her, and the children. Supervised by federal agents. Neutral location. She set very clear boundaries, and if you violate any of them, you'll never see them again. Do you understand?" "Yes." "She's doing this for the children. Not for you. They've been asking questions she can't answer anymore. This is their choice as much as hers." Roy's voice cracked. "When?" 2 weeks. We'll send details to your attorney. You'll have 1 hour, federal building, no physical contact without her explicit permission, no raised voices, no promises you can't keep." "I understand." "Mr. Scott?" Caroline's voice softened slightly. "Don't make her regret this." "I won't." The call ended. Roy stood in his penthouse holding his phone. 2 weeks, 14 days, 336 hours until he met his children. He sat down, and for the first time in decades, maybe the first time since his own father had died when Roy was 17, he cried. Not the controlled emotion of a man who'd mastered his image, but the raw, broken grief of someone who'd lost everything that didn't matter and finally found the thing that did. 2 weeks until he met Brian, Christopher, Liliana. 3 children who didn't know him. 3 children who had no reason to trust him. 3 children who'd lived entire lives in his absence. Roy looked at the calendar on his wall. 14 days to figure out how to be a father. 14 days too late, and maybe, just in time. He's meeting them in 2 weeks. But meeting them and earning them are 2 different things. Those 14 days were about to feel like 14 years. The federal building conference room was designed for neutrality. White walls, white table, 4 white chairs on one side, 2 on the other. Fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly clinical, slightly unreal, like a space designed for difficult conversations between people who'd chosen opposing sides. Roy arrived 30 minutes early. His ankle monitor had been temporarily deactivated for the meeting, a small mercy granted by a judge who'd read the case file and apparently decided even convicted criminals deserved a chance to meet their children. He sat on the side with 2 chairs. Waited. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd worn a suit. Then changed into slacks and a sweater. Then back to the suit. Then settled on dark jeans and a button-down because he didn't want to look like the CEO who'd valued profit over people, but he also didn't want to look like he wasn't taking this seriously. He'd put on cologne. Too much. The federal agent supervising had wrinkled her nose when he'd entered. Roy couldn't remember the last time he'd been this nervous. Couldn't remember the last time anything had mattered this much. At exactly 10 a.m., the door opened. Patricia entered first. Roy's breath caught. 6 years older, hair shorter, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, guarded in a way she'd never been when they'd worked together, when she'd believed systems could be changed and people could choose integrity. But still her. Still Patricia. Their eyes met for half a second before she looked away. Then 3 children walked in behind her. Roy couldn't breathe. 2 boys. 1 girl. Brian holding Christopher's hand protectively. Liliana clutching her mother's leg, peering around at Roy with dark, assessing eyes. All 3 staring at him. They had his eyes, his chin, his dark hair that stuck up slightly in the back no matter how much you tried to smooth it down. They were 6 years old, small, fragile, real, his children. Roy's vision blurred. Brian stepped slightly in front of his siblings. Already the protector at 6 years old. "Mom, who is he?" Patricia's hand rested on Brian's shoulder, steadying, grounding. Her voice was steady when she spoke. Professional, like she was introducing a colleague instead of the father of her children. "This is Roy Scott. He's your biological father." Silence. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes the air feel thick. Christopher's hand tightened in Brian's. "The one who had to go away?" Patricia's eyes closed briefly. A flash of pain she tried to hide, but couldn't quite manage. Roy found his voice. It came out rougher than he intended. "No, I'm the one who didn't know you existed." 3 pairs of eyes studied him. Identical expressions of confusion mixed with curiosity, mixed with something that looked like suspicion. Liliana spoke. Her voice was small, but clear. "Why?" The question that had no good answer. Roy looked at Patricia. She nodded slightly, permission to try. "Because," Roy's throat felt tight, "because I made mistakes. Bad ones. And your mother had to keep you safe from the consequences of those mistakes." "What mistakes?" Brian's voice was sharp, protective. Patricia sat down in one of the chairs on their side of the table, pulled the children close, Brian on her right, Christopher on her left, Liliana in her lap. "Your father made choices that hurt people," Patricia said carefully, choosing each word like she was diffusing a bomb. "I tried to stop it. When he wouldn't listen, I had to tell the truth to people who could. That put us in danger." Brian's eyes narrowed. "From him? From people who worked for him?" Roy knelt down, brought himself to their eye level even though the table separated them. "I didn't know," he said, looking at each child in turn. "I didn't know about any of this. I didn't know about you. Not until 2 weeks ago." Christopher studied him with those gentle, watchful eyes. "Mom said you had to go away." Roy looked at Patricia, saw the exhaustion in her face, the weight of 6 years of lying to protect them. "She was protecting you," Roy said quietly. "From my mistakes, from people who might have hurt you because of me. Everything she did, every time you had to move, every time she told you stories about a father who had to go away, she did it to keep you safe." "But you didn't keep us safe," Liliana said. Matter of fact. No accusation in her tone. Just observation. Roy's heart shattered. "No, I didn't. And I'm sorry." The hardest conversations aren't the ones where people yell. They're the ones where 6-year-olds ask questions that adults can barely answer. If this story is hitting you, if you're thinking about your own family, your own choices, your own second chances, leave a comment. Tell me what you'd do, because Roy's about to face a question that changes everything. Liliana slid off Patricia's lap, took 3 steps toward Roy. Small shoes on linoleum, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet room. She stopped just out of reach. "Are you the reason we couldn't stay anywhere long?" Roy's face crumbled. He didn't try to hide it, didn't try to control the emotion. He knelt lower, met her eyes directly. Yes, not directly, but yes. The company I built, the choices I made. They're why you had to move, why you couldn't have friends who knew your real names, why you didn't have a home you could count on. Liliana's head tilted, studying him with an intensity that reminded him painfully of Patricia. "Do you feel bad?" Roy's voice broke. "Every second of every day." She nodded slowly, like she was filing this information away for later analysis. Then she stepped back to her mother. Brian stood, the protector, the one who'd been keeping his siblings safe since before he was old enough to understand why they needed protecting. He walked to the table, put both hands on it, stared at Roy. "If you're our dad, what are our birthdays?" Roy swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I want to learn. What are they?" Christopher answered quietly. "March 7th. March 7th, Roy repeated, committing it to memory. "What else should I know?" Brian's voice was cold, harder than any 6-year-old's should be. "Everything. You missed everything." The words landed like physical blows. First steps, first words, first days of school, first nightmares, first questions about why they didn't have a father like other kids. 6 years of moments Roy would never get back. 6 years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays that built the foundation of who these children were becoming. He'd missed it all. "I know," Roy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I missed everything, and I can't fix that. I can't go back and be there when you needed me. But I'd like to try to be here for what's left, if you'll let me." Brian stared at him, calculating, assessing, trying to decide if this stranger was worth the risk. Patricia's hand settled on Brian's shoulder. Gentle pressure. A silent message. "Enough for today." "That's enough," she said quietly. The federal agent supervising from the corner checked her watch. "Time's up." Patricia stood, gathered the children. Brian came immediately. Christopher hesitated, looking back at Roy once before following his mother. Liliana lingered, looked at Roy with those dark, assessing eyes, not smiling, not afraid, just looking, like she was trying to memorize his face or decide if he was worth remembering. Then she turned and followed her mother to the door. Roy stood, didn't move, couldn't make himself try to follow or reach out or do anything except watch them leave. Patricia paused at the door, hand on the handle. Children clustered around her legs. She looked back at him. "They need time," she said. Roy nodded. "I have time, however much they need." Something in Patricia's expression softened. Not forgiveness, not trust, but possibility. "We'll see," she said. Then they were gone. The door closed. Roy stood alone in the white room with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the ghost of cologne he'd put on too thick because he'd been nervous about meeting his children. His children. Brian's protectiveness, Christopher's gentle observation, Liliana's unflinching questions. They were real, not abstractions or ideas or consequences. Real people with personalities and preferences and 6 years of life experiences that had shaped them into who they were. And they'd looked at him like a stranger. Because he was a stranger. He'd contributed DNA, but nothing else. Patricia had given them everything. Safety, stability as much as was possible, love fierce enough to uproot their lives 8 times to protect them. Roy had given them nothing except the reason they'd needed protecting in the first place. The federal agent cleared her throat. "Mr. Scott, we need to leave." Roy nodded, followed her out. The ankle monitor was reactivated at the door, house arrest reinstated. But as Roy sat in the federal vehicle being transported back to his penthouse, all he could think about was Liliana's look. The way she'd studied him. Not with hatred, not with fear, just with curiosity. Assessment. The possibility that maybe he could earn what biology had given him by default. Remember that look. That look matters. Because in that look was the fragile beginning of something Roy had never earned but desperately wanted. A chance. 3 weeks later. Roy stood in a public park in Brooklyn, holding a soccer ball he'd never used and wearing jeans that still had the store tags in his pocket because he'd bought them yesterday specifically for this. The second meeting. Approved by federal oversight. Supervised by an agent who stood 30 feet away trying to look casual while obviously monitoring every interaction. Less formal than the federal building. Patricia had requested outdoor space, neutral but not institutional. Roy had agreed to anything. The soccer ball had been Patricia's suggestion during their brief phone call to arrange logistics. They like soccer, or they would if they'd ever had the chance to play properly. Now Roy stood on slightly damp grass watching Patricia arrive with 3 6-year-olds who looked even smaller outside the white room. Brian held Christopher's hand. Liliana walked independently, scanning the park like she was cataloging exits. They spotted Roy, stopped walking. Patricia said something Roy couldn't hear. The children nodded, approached slowly. "Hi," Roy said. The word felt inadequate, awkward. 3 faces stared at him. Roy held up the soccer ball. "Anyone want to play?" Silence. Then Christopher's quiet voice. "We don't know how. I can teach you." Brian stepped forward. The protector. "Why should we learn from you?" Fair question. Roy had no good answer except the truth. "Because I'd like to spend time with you. And your mom said you like soccer, is that right?" Christopher nodded. "We watched it on TV sometimes, when we had TV." The casual mention of instability hit Roy like a punch. "How do you know we like soccer?" Liliana asked. Suspicious. "Your mom told me." Liliana looked back at Patricia, confirming. Patricia nodded. Liliana turned back to Roy. "Okay, show us." They played. Badly. Roy demonstrated how to kick, how to pass, how to aim for an imaginary goal marked by 2 backpacks. Christopher tried first. Kicked wrong. His foot caught under the ball instead of connecting properly. He fell. Roy moved instinctively. Helped him up. "You okay?" Christopher nodded, brushing grass off his knees. "Here, try it like this." Roy demonstrated again. Patient. No frustration when Christopher's second attempt wasn't much better than the first. Liliana watched from the sideline. "You're not very good at this either." Roy laughed. Actually laughed. "No, I'm not." "Why not?" "I never had anyone to play with." Brian frowned. "Why not?" Roy positioned the ball for Christopher to try again. "I was busy working. I thought work was more important than people." Liliana's voice was matter-of-fact. "That's dumb." "Yes," Roy agreed quietly. "Yes, it was." Brian kicked the ball, hard. It sailed past the backpack goal. "Good kick," Roy said. Brian didn't smile, but he didn't glare either. Progress. Patricia watched from a bench 20 feet away. The federal agent, a woman named Torres who'd supervised both meetings, stood nearby. "He's trying," Torres said quietly. Patricia's hands were clasped in her lap. Tight. "Trying doesn't erase 6 years." "No, but it's a start." Patricia watched Roy crouch down to Christopher's level, showing him again how to kick. Patient when Christopher's attempt sent the ball sideways instead of forward. Watched Brian slowly stop glaring, start participating instead of just monitoring for threats. Watched Liliana peppering Roy with questions. "Why did you work so much? Do you still work? Where do you live? Do you have other kids?" And Roy answering each one honestly. Something in Patricia's chest loosened. Not forgiveness, not trust, but possibility. The recognition that maybe Roy wasn't trying to reclaim something he'd lost. Maybe he was trying to build something he'd never had. After 30 minutes, the children were sweaty and laughing. Actually laughing. Christopher had finally connected with the ball properly, His face had lit up with surprised joy. Brian had scored 3 goals and allowed himself a small smile. Liliana had declared herself the referee and was taking the responsibility very seriously. They looked like normal children having a normal afternoon, something Patricia hadn't been able to give them in 6 years. Liliana ran over to Patricia, flushed, happy. "Mom, can he come to our house?" Patricia's throat tightened. "We don't have a house yet, baby. Remember? We're still in the temporary place." Roy, standing close enough to overhear, frowned. "What do you mean?" Patricia hesitated. This wasn't information she wanted to share. Wasn't weakness she wanted to show. But the children were listening. Witness protection ended when the trial concluded. "We're transitioning. Finding somewhere permanent. Where are you staying?" "A motel. Until I find work. Get an apartment." Roy's face changed. Horror. Realization. Guilt. "I can help." Patricia stood. "I don't want your money, Roy." "It's not for you." Roy's voice was urgent. "It's for them." Brian was watching. Christopher, too. Liliana studying both adults with those sharp, assessing eyes. "Can we talk?" Patricia gestured away from the children. Roy followed. They stood under a tree, out of earshot. Agent Torres watching, but not listening. Roy spoke first. "I have a property. Guest house on my estate. It's been empty for years. 3 bedrooms, backyard, safe neighborhood. It's yours if you want it." "Roy, I'm not asking to be part of your life. I'm asking to make sure you have one." His voice cracked. "They deserve stability. They deserve a home that doesn't change every 6 months. Let me give them that." Patricia looked at 3 children playing with a soccer ball, at motel rooms with stained carpets and neighbors who shouted at midnight. At 6 years of running. "Why are you doing this?" Roy's eyes met hers. "Because you shouldn't have to keep running. Not anymore. Because I can't fix the past 6 years, but maybe I can help with the next 6. Because they're my children and you did all the work, and I want to do something, anything, that actually matters." Patricia studied his face, looking for manipulation, for control, for the Roy who'd chosen empire over ethics. She didn't find him. She found a broken man trying to build something from ruins. "One condition," she said. "You don't have a key. I call the shots. You visit on my schedule. If I say stop, you stop. Immediately." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay." 1 week later. Patricia stood in the guest house Roy had described. 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, windows with actual curtains, a kitchen with appliances that worked, a backyard with grass and a fence and space to play. It smelled like fresh paint and new carpet and possibility. The motel they'd left that morning had smelled like cigarette smoke and mildew and other people's desperation. Brian, Christopher, and Liliana ran through rooms, claiming spaces. "This one's mine," Liliana, in the smallest bedroom with windows facing the backyard. "I want this one," Christopher in the middle room with blue walls. "Can I have this one, Mom?" Brian in the largest room, already thinking about where his siblings would fit if they got scared at night. Patricia stood in the doorway crying. Happy tears. Relief tears. Exhausted tears from 6 years of holding everything together with willpower and lies and the desperate hope that someday they'd be safe enough to stop running. Brian found her, wrapped small arms around her waist. "Is this real?" His voice was small, uncertain. "Can we stay?" Patricia knelt down, held her son. Her protector who'd been protecting since before he understood what from. "Yes, baby, we can stay." "Forever?" Patricia looked around the house, at sunlight streaming through clean windows, at rooms her children could make their own, at a future that didn't involve packing bags in the middle of the night. "As long as we need to," she said. And for the first time in 6 years, she believed it. 6 months later, Roy showed up every Saturday at 10 a.m. Not 9:55, not 10:15, 10 a.m. exactly, because Brian needed structure, needed to know that when someone said they'd be there, they actually would be. Sometimes they went to parks. Sometimes museums. Sometimes they just sat at the kitchen table and colored with markers that smelled like fruit, and left stains on Roy's expensive shirts that he'd stopped caring about. Roy learned things. Brian liked structure, rules, knowing what to expect. He needed advance notice before changes and explanations for why things were happening. He was the protector who'd been protecting since before he understood why, and now he needed someone else to take that weight. Christopher liked stories, books with dragons and heroes and happy endings. He'd curl up on the couch with whatever Roy was reading and just listen. Didn't need conversation, just presence. Liliana liked questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do thoughts come from? What happens when you die? She asked them rapid fire and studied Roy's face while he answered to see if he was telling the truth. Roy learned to buy 3 different types of snacks because they had different preferences. Pretzels for Brian, animal crackers for Christopher, apple slices for Liliana. He learned that being a dad wasn't about grand gestures or money or control. It was about showing up, consistently, even when they didn't want him there. Even when Brian watched him with suspicious eyes, and Liliana asked questions designed to catch him in lies, and Christopher barely spoke at all. It was about earning trust in increments so small they were almost invisible. Until they weren't. Christopher got the flu in November. 6 years old, almost 7 now, small for his age, gentle in ways that made Roy's chest ache because the world wasn't built for gentle boys. Roy showed up on Saturday with soup, homemade. He'd learned to cook in the past 6 months because takeout felt impersonal, and he wanted to give them something he'd made with his own hands. Patricia let him in. He's upstairs. Fever finally broke, but he's exhausted. Roy climbed stairs that creaked, found Christopher in bed surrounded by stuffed animals and tissues. Pale, tired, but awake. Hey, buddy, I brought soup. Christopher's face brightened slightly. The kind with stars? The kind with stars. Roy sat on the edge of the bed, helped Christopher sit up, held the bowl while Christopher managed a few spoonfuls. Thanks, Dad. The word hung in the air. Christopher's eyes opened wider, realizing what he'd said. I mean... Roy's throat closed. His voice came out rough, breaking. It's okay. You can call me that, if you want. Christopher studied his face, those gentle, watchful eyes seeing everything Roy was trying not to show. Do you want me to? Roy nodded. Couldn't speak. Couldn't trust his voice. More than anything, he finally managed. Christopher smiled. Small. Tired. Real. Okay, Dad. Patricia stood in the doorway crying, hand over her mouth, watching her middle child, her gentle one who felt everything so deeply, give Roy the gift he'd been waiting months to receive. The word he'd never earned but desperately wanted. Dad. Brian still wouldn't say it. 3 weeks later, Roy found Brian alone in the backyard, 7 years old and already carrying the weight of the world on shoulders too small for the burden. Roy sat on the grass beside him, didn't push, just waited. Finally, can I ask you something? Brian looked at him, guarded. What? Why won't you call me Dad? Silence. Then, because dads don't leave. Roy absorbed the blow, nodded. You're right. They don't. I didn't leave. But I wasn't there. And that's worse. So why should I trust you now? Roy looked at his son, at the protector who'd been protecting since he could walk, who'd held his siblings' hands through 8 moves and 100 moments of fear. Because I'm going to keep showing up. Every week. Every month. Every year. Until you believe me. What if I never do? Roy's voice was steady. Then I'll still show up. Brian studied him, looking for the lie, the condition, the moment when Roy would prove him right and disappear. He didn't find it. Didn't smile. But something in his posture softened. Just slightly. Okay, Brian said. Not forgiveness. Not acceptance. But possibility. The phone call came on a Tuesday. Roy was reading another parenting book because he was still learning when an unknown number appeared on his screen. "Mr. Scott, this is Principal Davies from Riverside Elementary. We have Liliana Posey here. She's having a panic attack. We called her mother, but she's not answering." Roy was moving before the sentence finished. "I'm 20 minutes away. Tell her I'm coming. We weren't sure if we should. I'm her emergency contact. I'm coming." Patricia was in a job interview. Phone off. Finally taking steps toward building a career again after 6 years of under-the-table work. The school had called Roy because Patricia had added him to the emergency contact list 1 month ago without telling him, a trust he hadn't known he'd earned. Roy found Liliana in the nurse's office, hyperventilating, tears streaming, small hands clutching her chest like she couldn't breathe. 7 years old and having a panic attack because someone had mentioned moving to a new school district, and her brain, trained by 6 years of instability, had immediately gone to worst-case scenarios. Roy knelt in front of her. "Liliana, look at me." She couldn't. Eyes unfocused, breathing too fast. "Liliana, breathe with me. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He counted, demonstrated. Patient. She followed, shakily at first, then steadier. "Good, again, in for 4. They breathed together until her breathing slowed. Until her hands unclenched, until she could see him again. "I thought we had to move again," she whispered. Roy's heart broke. "No, sweetheart. You're staying. I promise." "How do you know?" "Because I'll make sure of it. You're not moving. You're not leaving. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Liliana studied his face, looking for the lie. Found only certainty. She nodded, exhausted from the panic. "Okay." Roy held her until Patricia arrived 40 minutes later. Frantic, terrified, guilty for not answering her phone. That night, after the children were asleep, Patricia found Roy sitting on the front porch of the guest house. He was leaving, respecting the boundaries they'd established, but moving slowly. Reluctant to go. Patricia sat beside him. "Thank you. For today." "I'm their father. You don't thank someone for that." "I do when—" Patricia stopped, started again. "I'm sorry. For not telling you. For keeping them from you." Roy looked at her. Really looked. "You did what you had to do. I'm sorry for making you have to do it." First honest conversation in 7 years. Patricia's voice was quiet. "They're starting to trust you. What about you?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm getting there. Not love, not even forgiveness yet, but trust, growing slowly, carefully, built on 6 months of Roy showing up and doing what he said he'd do." "That's enough," Roy said. "More than enough." Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. For the first time in 6 years, Patricia and the children had a tree. Real decorations, traditions they could count on repeating. Roy had been invited. Not expected. Not assumed, but invited. He arrived at 8 a.m. with 3 gifts carefully wrapped and a nervousness in his chest that felt like being 17 again. Brian, Christopher, and Liliana ran down the stairs in matching pajamas Patricia had bought specifically because they'd never had matching anything before. 3 gifts waited under the tree marked, "From Dad." Christopher opened his first, a book about dragons and the brave knights who befriended them. His eyes lit up. Liliana opened hers next, a journal with a lock and key because she liked secrets and private thoughts and having something that was only hers. Brian opened his last. A compass. Old-fashioned. Brass. With an engraving. "You've been the protector, now let me protect you." Brian read the card. Looked at Roy. Didn't smile, but nodded. Small. Deliberate. Real. Recognition that Roy had seen him. Known him. Understood what he'd been carrying. Patricia watched from the kitchen doorway, hand over her heart, crying again. Not sad tears, not scared tears, hope tears, for the family they were slowly, carefully becoming. 2 years later. Roy's house arrest had ended 14 months ago. He could leave the state, leave the country, start over somewhere people didn't recognize him as the billionaire who'd fallen from grace. He stayed, because 30 minutes away in a guest house that had become a home, 3 8-year-olds were growing up. And Roy Scott wasn't missing another moment. March 7th arrived sunny and unseasonably warm, the triplets' 8th birthday. Patricia had planned a party, real party, with invitations sent to classmates and decorations hung in the backyard and a cake ordered from an actual bakery instead of made at midnight from whatever ingredients were on hand. Because they'd been in one place long enough to have friends. Real friends who knew their real names and came to their house and didn't have to be left behind when federal agents appeared at 2 a.m. Roy arrived at 9 to help set up. Patricia was already arranging tables, stressed in the way parents get when they want everything perfect for their children. "Balloons go there," she directed. "No, there. Roy, can you—" "On it." They moved around each other with practiced ease. Not romantic, not yet. Maybe not ever. But partnership. Two people who'd hurt each other and healed separately and were learning to exist in the same space for the sake of 3 children who needed them both. The party started at noon. 12 8-year-olds descended on the backyard like a cheerful invasion. Running, screaming, playing games Patricia had found on Pinterest. Brian was in his element. He'd organized teams for Capture the Flag and was explaining rules with the seriousness of a general briefing troops. Christopher sat under a tree, reading to 2 quieter kids who'd gravitated toward him. Liliana held court near the snack table, asking every adult questions about their jobs and lives and opinions on whether aliens existed. A parent Roy didn't recognize approached. "Are you the birthday kid's dad?" Roy froze, still not used to the question. Brian appeared before he could answer. "Yeah, this is my dad." Casual, matter of fact, like it was the most normal thing in the world, not biological father, not the man who wasn't there. Dad. The parent smiled. "Nice to meet you. My daughter Emily loves playing with Liliana." Roy shook hands, made conversation, functioned like a normal parent at a normal birthday party. But inside, his chest felt like it might crack open. Brian had called him Dad, in public, in front of people, casually, like it was true. Roy excused himself, walked around the side of the house, leaned against the wall, pressed his palms against his eyes. "You okay?" Christopher. Gentle, watchful, always seeing what others missed. Roy cleared his throat. "Yeah, buddy. I'm perfect." Christopher studied him. "You're crying. Happy crying?" Christopher nodded, seemed to understand. "Brian called you Dad." "Yeah, he did. He's been practicing, in his room, when he thinks no one's listening." Roy's breath caught. "Really?" "Yeah, he wanted to make sure it sounded right." Christopher paused. "Does it?" Roy knelt down, eye level with his son. "It sounds perfect." Christopher smiled, hugged him quickly, then ran back to his friends. Roy stayed there another moment, collecting himself, memorizing the feeling. After cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, the triplets' unanimous choice. After games and presents and organized chaos, the other children left. The triplets sat on the back porch surrounded by new toys and wrapping paper, exhausted, happy, sugar high crashing into fatigue. Liliana looked at Roy with those sharp, assessing eyes. "Dad, why weren't you there when we were born?" The question stopped all conversation. Patricia started to intervene. "Liliana, it's okay," Roy said. He sat on the porch steps. The triplets gathered around him. Patricia stood nearby, watchful. Roy chose honesty, complete, unflinching. "I made bad choices. I hurt people. Your mom tried to stop me and I didn't listen, so she had to leave to keep you safe. She was protecting you from my mistakes." Brian's voice was serious. "Are you still making bad choices?" "I try not to. And when I do, I own them now. I apologize. I try to fix them. I don't hide them anymore." Liliana nodded. Good. That was it. Question asked. Question answered. Children satisfied. They went inside to play with new toys. Roy stayed on the porch. Patricia sat beside him. You handled that well, she said. I just told the truth. Silence. Comfortable now, instead of weighted. Then Patricia's voice, quiet. What if they resent me later, for keeping them from you? Roy looked at her, saw the fear she rarely showed, the guilt she carried. They won't. You gave them life, twice, once when they were born, and again when you kept them safe. But they missed having a father. They had you. That was enough. Now they have both of us. That's more than enough. Patricia's eyes were wet. When did you get wise? Roy smiled. Sad. Real. When I lost everything that didn't matter. The visitor arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday. Lauren Mitchell, Roy's former executive assistant, one of 3 employees who'd stayed through the collapse. She stood at Roy's door, his actual house, the one he barely lived in because he spent most evenings at the guest house, with nervous hands and determined eyes. I need to tell you something, she said. Roy let her in, made coffee, waited. I sent you that medical report, 6 years ago, the one about Patricia and the triplets. Roy went still. Why? Lauren's voice was careful. Because I knew her. Patricia. We were friends before everything happened. Not close, but friendly. We'd get coffee sometimes. Talk. Roy listened. She called me once, years after she disappeared. I don't know how she got my number. She was drunk, crying, said she wished you knew about the children, that they asked about you and she didn't know what to say. She hung up before I could respond. Never called again. Lauren looked at her hands. But I remembered. And when she testified, when I saw her name in the sealed documents I wasn't supposed to see, I thought, you deserve to know. They deserved for you to know. Roy's throat was tight. You risked your career, your freedom, accessing sealed documents. I know, but some things are more important than protocol. Thank you, Roy said, for giving me a chance I didn't earn. Lauren smiled. You've earned it now? The loop closed. The mystery solved. An act of compassion from an unexpected source. That night, Roy tucked in 3 8-year-olds. A routine now. Normal. Expected. Brian in his room with books organized by height and a nightlight shaped like a compass. Will you be here tomorrow? Brian asked. The question he still needed answered sometimes. Yes. Christopher in his room with stuffed animals arranged around him like guards. And the day after? Yes. Liliana in her room with drawings taped to every wall and a journal under her pillow. Forever? Roy knelt beside her bed. As long as you'll have me. Liliana considered this. Okay, good. They slept. Roy found Patricia on the front porch, their usual spot now, where they processed the day and made plans for tomorrow. We did okay, didn't we? Patricia said, looking at the house, at the life they'd built. Roy shook his head. You did. I'm just catching up. No. Patricia's voice was firm. We did. Together. Roy looked at her. Saw forgiveness. Saw partnership. Saw possibility for something they hadn't defined yet, and maybe never would. Saw the woman who'd saved 3 lives by making impossible choices. Yeah, he said softly. We did. Roy left an hour later, drove to his empty house, then turned around. Parked in the guest house driveway. Looked at 3 windows. 3 rooms. 3 lights left on because children still feared the dark sometimes. His children. Brian with his need for structure and his fierce protective instincts. Christopher with his gentle soul and his love of stories. Liliana with her endless questions and her unflinching honesty. His second chance. He didn't get to see their first steps or hear their first words. Didn't get to comfort their first nightmares or celebrate their first days of school. Didn't get to watch them learn to walk or talk or become the people they were becoming. But he was here now. and they were letting him stay. Some men build empires. Roy Scott had built one once, watched it burn, lost everything he thought mattered. Now he was learning to build something harder. Trust, family, love that wasn't guaranteed or inherited, but earned. One Saturday at a time. One answered question, one kept promise, one moment of showing up when showing up was all they needed. The beginning isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you choose to stay.